Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, and the abode of the Dalai Lama, had come under the control of the Chinese army. Towards the end of the 50s, Chinese troops started intruding into Indian territory in Ladakh, Parahoti, and the northeast. In the uninhabited Aksai Chin Plateau of Ladakh, they constructed a road across Indian territory. Indian patrols were fired upon, killing many. Who sent a strong protest and invited the Chinese leaders for talks. India maintained that the McMahon Line and the Himalayan watershed were the boundary according to the Treaty of 1914. China agreed to attend the official level talks. When repression increased in Tibet, the Dalai Lama, the spiritual head of Tibet, escaped. He was granted asylum in India, in keeping with international convention. But the Chinese were unhappy. Chinese incursions into Indian territory increased in the northeast and in Ladakh. On the 20th of October 1962, the Chinese army launched a massive attack on India, both in Ladakh and in the northeast. The Indian army was not prepared for such a full-scale invasion. Nehru was shocked by this unprovoked act of treachery.
Instances in history where one country, that is India, has gone out of her way to be friendly and cooperative with the Chinese government and people and to plead their cause in the councils of the world, and then for the Chinese government to return evil for good and even go to the extent of committing aggression and invade our sacred land.
In a Radio Hanoi broadcast tonight, Vietnam admitted Chinese troops are advancing. Several provincial capitals are threatened. Already 2 major Vietnamese towns are said to have been overrun, plus a string of villages along the 500-mile border. As the two communist nations battle, President Carter's been busy determining what the U.S. response should be. White House correspondent George Strait reports.
Official U.S. policy toward the conflict in Asia was developed at a morning meeting here at the White House between Secretary of State Vance, National Security Advisor Brzezinski, Vice President Mondale, their staffs, and the President by phone from Camp David. At that meeting, 4 principles were decided upon. First, the U.S. will not become directly involved militarily. Second, the United States will use any diplomatic leverage it gained during Vice Premier Deng's visit here to encourage the Chinese to pull out of Vietnam. Third, we will try to get the United Nations involved in coming up with a solution to the whole Southeast Asian problem. And finally, our allies in the region, namely Thailand, will be protected. But few believe Thailand is in any immediate danger. What all of this means is that U.S. officials are now in a holding pattern, waiting to see what happens in Asia before any American action is contemplated. White House officials concede that intelligence reports that they've received so far indicate that there is a real possibility that the Soviet Union will respond militarily to the invasion of its ally Vietnam by China. But few expect that response to be massive, and no one here has any fears that that response will lead to a superpower confrontation. George Strait, ABC News, the White House.
This is Bob Brown. Chinese news broadcasts have shown none of the current fighting, only scenes from past skirmishes along the border with Vietnam. But diplomatic sources say 2 district capitals have fallen to the Chinese, and 12 villages in 4 provinces have been overrun. Radio Hanoi claimed Vietnamese defenders had inflicted heavy casualties and disabled nearly 60 tanks, but also admitted that 2 provincial capitals were threatened. The Chinese greatly outnumber the Vietnamese, who are fighting back with civilian militia. Many of Vietnam's best troops are in Cambodia, where they helped overthrow a regime that was friendly to China. Today, the new Cambodian regime signed a peace and cooperation treaty with Vietnam. China's loss of its Cambodian alliance, coupled with Vietnam's strong ties to the Soviet Union, apparently convinced the Chinese that some assertive action had to be taken. Now, the Soviets are studying their options. This is one of several meetings the Russians say were held in factories and universities to demonstrate solidarity with Vietnam. Pravda said the Soviet Union will honor its recent treaty with Vietnam. The treaty is not, however, a military alliance, and the ultimate response of the Soviets may depend on the extent of China's actions in Vietnam. China has suggested its invasion is punitive, that its troops eventually will return to guard the frontier. The United States, says Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Frank Church, should stay out.
These are communist governments fighting one another. If they are determined to fight, then I say let them fight. We don't have to be the center piece of every war that comes along.
In areas close to the conflict, the apprehension is greatest. Thailand's Prime Minister Shamanan has just completed a U.S. visit to meet with administration advisors. And despite U.S. reassurances today that Thailand will be protected, he issued a statement to say, "We want to ask one thing, just don't get us involved." Bob Brown, ABC News.
Besides worrying her neighbors, China's invasion of Vietnam could further complicate deliberations in Washington over the naming of the first U.S. ambassador to Peking. The U.S. and China have agreed to exchange ambassadors by March 1st, but new debates in Congress over Taiwan's safety will likely be fueled by China's attack on neighboring Vietnam. This could delay the confirmation of Ambassador-designate Leonard Woodcock.
The Chinese invasion there has supposedly ended, but the Vietnamese appear to be taking no chances. We have a first-hand report from Hanoi from ABC's Jim Laurie.
The Chinese invasion lasted 27 days. It was a poor man's war. Little else but infantry and artillery were used. The Chinese set out to teach Vietnam a lesson. But here in Hanoi, the only lesson Vietnam appears to have learned is to wage a better battle next time. While most analysts have called it a war no one won, Vietnam is hailing it as a victory. This rally organized to prove it. Behind all the celebration, though, we found here a sense that Vietnam needed to bolster national morale. Rallies like this, said one diplomat, are what keeps the machine going. It helps people forget the nation's troubles, its faltering economy, the war's devastation. This is where the Chinese invasion ended 100 miles from Hanoi, 11 to the China border. The Chinese may have stopped here, but with their devastating firepower, they left no doubt in Vietnamese minds that they could return at any time. If Vietnam was not sufficiently prepared then for the Chinese attack, it is preparing now. As far as the eye can see, trenches are being dug along the hills north of Hanoi. Militia and local forces bore the brunt of the Chinese attack. Now they are being replaced by regular army divisions. After more than 30 years, the Ho Chi Minh Sandal has yet to be retired. Vietnam again is on a war footing. In the city, it's general mobilization. Rooftop anti-aircraft guns, not used since they downed American bombers, are being reactivated. In parks around town, everyone is taking military training. And so, while many may see the Chinese withdrawal and the prospect of negotiations as positive signs, the Vietnamese see them as reasons for heightened vigilance in a land where war seems almost a permanent condition of life. Jim Laurie, ABC News, in Hanoi.